Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kelly. I am so glad that you're here with me today. I've been tagged by Martyna at Books and Crafts in the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. So I'm excited to do that today. Let's get started. The first question is, what is your fantasy origin story? Basically, what kind of books got you into fantasy? And I really owe this to my third grade teacher, who really amazingly, just reading to us books after lunch, informed a lot of where my tastes were going to go with reading. And she read us the Chronicles of Narnia, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. And it just really propelled me into being a fantasy reader at the age of like 9. So I'm just very thankful to that third grade teacher for doing that. The next question is, if you could be a hero in a story, who would be the author and what trope would you insist on? Okay, there's 2 tropes I really love. Can I have 2? It's my turn to do the tag, so I think I can bend the rules a little bit. I love the friends to lovers trope, because it just is so heartwarming. And the other really heartwarming trope is the found family trope. So I love those 2. And if we get to pick an author, let's just go epic. Let's do Brandon Sanderson, because I know that's going to be one epic story. So let's do him. The next question is, what is a fantasy book you've read this year that you want other people to read? Well, I decided to do a buddy read with my friend Nicole at Dusty Book Sniffers. She was going to be reading The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, and I never read Robin Hobb before, and I am now on the 3rd book in the Farseers trilogy. So I started with Assassin's Apprentice, and I really, really like Robin Hobb. I think that if you like fantasy and you have not tried Robin Hobb before, Assassin's Apprentice was a great place to start. It's a wonderful political fantasy, and I just love it. The next question: what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, and what is one that you haven't read much from? Well, my favorite subgenre would probably have to be middle grade. There's just something about it that's usually so whimsical. You usually have just such a feeling of fantasy in a slightly more innocent way, and I really enjoy that. Don't get me wrong, I love my adult fantasy, I love my young adult fantasy, but there's something about that middle grade fantasy that is just so much fun and just so magical. And then one that I have not read much of is political fantasy, but that is changing with Robin Hobb. And then I got into Mistborn this year. I'm on the 2nd book right now. I'm listening to the 2nd book, and those are both pretty political fantasies. So that's changing, but it's something that I had not read much of until here very recently. All right, who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? Well, I got back into reading fantasy after I'd been really more into a mystery and thriller type thing in my early 20s. In my late 20s, I decided to pick up some YA fantasy, and that's when I discovered Cassandra Clare. And there's just something about the Cassandra Clare novels that just gets me, and I like to reread them. There's something about them that's so entertaining. I think what it is that it's fantasy, but also I usually really ship the main romance, and that doesn't always happen, but there's something about the main romance that she plugs in the stories that really, I always just seem to ship the romance. So that's why I think. Next, how do you typically find fantasy recommendations? Well, now it's BookTube. It's like my buddies on BookTube. I've found the people who I can trust their recommendations, and it really is how I get them now. Upcoming fantasy release you're excited about? Well, speaking of some middle grade fantasy, there is a series called the Nevermore series, and the Trials of Morgan Crow is the 1st book. The 4th book in the series is going to be coming out at the end of September, and it's called Silverborn: The Mystery of Morgan Crow by Jessica Townsend. And I think that they are just such great books, as far as there is a young girl and she has these skills that she didn't know that she possessed. And I just love again, speaking of found family trope, the person that ends up being her guardian. I love their relationship. I think it's a fun series. And next, what is one misconception about fantasy you'd like to lay to rest? I hear from people a lot that they are afraid that the fantasy genre is too confusing or too hard to follow. So a lot of times I think that is something that people have a misconception on. There are some fantasy books that may have slightly complicated fantasy elements to them, or the magic system is confusing, but generally, even though they tend to be longer books, they don't feel like long reads, and usually the authors do a pretty good job of explaining the magic system. All right, last, is there someone that you know that doesn't read a lot of fantasy? Ask for a recommendation. What are the first 3 books that come to mind? All right, so the first book that comes to mind to me is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, because it is one that I've had a lot of people tell me that don't read fantasy that they really, really love that book, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. It's about a girl who kind of makes a deal where she doesn't have to marry someone that she's got an arranged marriage to. And so the catch is that this, like, God gives her this ability to kind of not grow older, and she can kind of go away from this life she was kind of born to lead. But people forget her as soon as they don't see her for a second. So it's a very interesting story, and a lot of people that don't like fantasy seem to like that one. The other one that I hear a lot of, and you're going to hear my sons in the background, sorry. Another one that I think that I've heard from a lot of people that aren't big fantasy readers like was Caraval by Stephanie Garber. And this is kind of a YA book that deals with sisters that are playing a game, and it has a very fantastical built-up world. And the third one, I'm just going to say Chronicles of Narnia. It worked for me, and it got me into it, and I think that it would be a great one to start with. Even though it's a children's book, it's wonderful. All right, I said lastly, but there is one more thing before I tag people. It said, is there a fantasy booktuber that you would like to shout out? And the first people, because it's a duo, a brother and sister duo that comes to mind, is the channel Erudite Adventure. And the brother, Tony, ends up doing a lot of fantasy recommendations solo. They do some recommendations together, and the sister Kate, I've noticed that she and I have a lot in common as far as classics. So they're great young people, but Tony, I love his recommendations, and I usually end up agreeing with everything he says, either if I've already read it or end up reading the book later. So I'd like to shout them out. And as far as people to tag today, I'm going to tag Heather at Heather's Heroes and Heroines. She has a great channel. Please go check her out. And the other person that I'm going to tag is going to be Lotta's Nook. I've noticed that she has a lot of Sarah J. Maas content on there, which of course is fantasy, and I'd love to hear her answers to this. I hope you guys are doing well. Have a great day and read a lot. Bye-bye.